Okay, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Aslam Bulbulia. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this third and final day of the Muslims on Turtle Island series. I'm joining from the unceded land of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the land that you're joining from, there's a resource that we often share called nativeland.ca, where you can learn about the land that you're on just by typing in your address, and you can find out more about it. And you can also support that project through Patreon. We've also got a few different links, an introduction wall where you can introduce yourself to other participants in the series, and then you can see some reflections from day 1, day 2, and add your reflections to day 3 as well. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Corrigan, who will be the first guest speaker for today. Chris has been a longtime friend and mentor since I arrived in Vancouver, and he has been involved with the United Church and thinking about the spiritual practices that come into play when thinking about being on unceded land. So Chris will host us for the next 15 minutes or so, and then we'll take a short break before the next session. Over to you, Chris. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Good morning. See some of your faces. Nice to see some of your faces. Just to be able to get some feedback and say hello. So if you're willing, that would be lovely. Just to say hello, good morning. Good to see you. My name is Chris Corrigan. I live on wlélex, which is the Squamish name for Bowen Island. It's very near to Vancouver. It's in Squamish Atlas, which is the name of the land I live on, the territory I live on, Squamish Traditional Territory. I'm a Christian. I've been a person who has practiced within the United Church of Canada since I was a little boy. I was born and raised, baptized in that church, and have a deep family history with that church, actually. And today I want to talk a little bit about what being a Christian on stolen lands has meant for me, how it's changed my practice, and how the church in general has shifted and changed, I think, over the last number of decades. I'm not speaking on behalf of the United Church. I'm a member of the United Church, and I occasionally, once a month actually, I lead worship at our local little United Church here on Bowen Island. So I'm an active participant. I'm also a board member of the Rivendell Retreat Center on Bowen Island, which I don't know if you've been there, it's a contemplative retreat center open to people of all faiths, but it's held by a contemplative Christian community of which I'm a part as well. And that's actually a part of my story too that I'll share. One of the things, just as we begin, actually, I'm curious why you're here, and curious what you think I can tell you, what you would be interested in learning. So if you want to pop into the chat, like particular questions about the United Church, about what we've done in the last number of decades, and just about my own practice as a Christian living here, please go ahead and throw some stuff into the chat. That will help me be able to meet your needs as well today. And so I can just keep half an eye on that as we go. And thank you, Itrat. You're very welcome to come back to Rivendell. Let me start by, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. So I was born and raised, baptized in the United Church as a little kid. My family was associated with this church from its very beginning, which was in the 1920s. My great-great-grandfather was present at the opening service, opening worship of the United Church in 1925. And where the United Church comes from, just to give you some context, is in Canada in the 1920s, sort of the early part of the 20th century, 3 major denominations talked about amalgamating. So the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, and the Congregationalist Church. And these represented quite a lot of Protestant congregations in Canada. Decided they would come together and form a United Church. And that unification, that union happened in 1925. And it became at that point kind of like the biggest Protestant denomination in Canada. And very influential, I would say. Many people, Tommy Douglas, for example, is United Church minister. a lot of progressive politics originated in the United Church. So there's a close connection between the United Church and the CCF, the Commonwealth Cooperative Federation, that was the precursor of the NDP. It was the United Church is and always has been a very progressive Christian denomination, and a very socially progressive Christian denomination, and it was super active in its first 40 years in making social change that created healthcare and unemployment insurance and a lot of stuff that was involved with the state. And part of that had to do with the fact that the church itself was super connected to the state. It wasn't a state religion, but it was probably the closest thing in Canada we've had to a state church for quite a long time. Starting around the mid-1960s, like many mainline Protestant churches, it started to decline, and many of the mainline denominations in Canada have done that all the way through from the 1960s to the present day, where churches, congregations have shrunk, church buildings have been sold off, there's been amalgamations and so on. And that's an important part of the story, because what that has meant was that people who were in the United Church, maybe more for the status and influence and less for the spiritual practice, kind of fled the church to other places like, I don't know, Rotary or Chambers of Commerce or wherever people go to try and influence social policy. And the church actually ended up, in my experience, the church ended up being more kind of concentrated. Like folks who were there for the spiritual practice alone, because it almost became countercultural. And it almost is nowadays. If you sort of say to people you're a Christian, people are like, oh, it's almost a countercultural thing. So I'm fine with that, no problem. In fact, I'm fine with being in a decaying structure because it opens up a whole lot of possibilities. As a young man, I wanted to be a minister in the United Church. I felt very deeply called to lead congregations and to do that. And I had some very strong mentors in my life. And they helped shape me by getting me involved in the church. The United Church is governed at 3 different levels, or it was at that time 4 different levels. There's a general council that meets every 2 years, and it's a democratic church. So people from all congregations across the country come together, representatives come together and decide on church policy. They elect leadership, so the moderator of the church is elected at that general council and has a 2-year term. In 1986, I was a delegate to the General Council. It was held in Sudbury, Ontario. And Bob Smith, who was the minister at First United Church in Vancouver, was elected moderator, or he was moderator from the previous term. And at that time, a number of Indigenous elders had got together over the previous 3 or 4 years to talk about getting the church to confront its role in colonization. And primarily the the elimination of Indigenous spirituality, and they wanted an apology. And so people like Alberta Billy from Wlélex on Vancouver Quadra Island, people like Murray Wheatung from Curve Lake in Ontario, Stan Mackay from Manitoba, Art Solomon, who was from Northern Ontario, Jim Dumont and his brother from Northern Ontario, were all involved in this movement to get the church to apologize. And this was 1986. Now, the United Church was involved in residential schools. The United Church operated a small number of residential schools. And so in the meeting in 1986, there were still residential schools operating, although I don't think under the guise of the United Church at that time. But many of the people who were in the room were people who were both residential school survivors, as well as residential school administrators and teachers. And I have to say, it was the only time in my life I was in the room where we actually had that conversation together. In many other times, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, most of that was survivors testifying about their experience with residential schools without the folks who have been committing some of these acts in the room as well. So it was an incredible moment to be in that room in Laurentian University with 600 of us. Many, many Indigenous, both ministers and congregation members from across the country had gathered. And the day that we were debating the wording of the apology, the conversation went really deep into the night. And I think it was one of those moments where there was an awful lot of feeling in the room that we needed to spare the feelings of those that had had good intentions. You know what I mean? It's like, well, the residential schools were set up with good intentions. You know, we can't completely throw out all the work. And many of us who were in the room were like, are you kidding? Like, we cannot redeem what happened in these places. We knew this back in the 1980s. And we had heard from survivors who were with us, who were sitting with us, who were our brothers and sisters in the church. We had heard these stories. We knew these stories. We knew what had gone on in 1986. So none of this was a surprise, right? So we talked and we talked and we talked into the night. And then we arrived at this incredible apology. And I want to read you the apology. I'm going to screen share it with you as well so you can see it. This is from the United Church website. This is the first of two apologies that happened, but this was the 1986 apology. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's right here. And we created this wording, and the moderator, Bob Smith, took this to the elders who were sitting in a teepee outside in a parking lot. We were late into the night at that point, and he said, long before my people journeyed to this land, your people were here, and you received from your elders an understanding of the creation and of the mystery that surrounds us, all that was deep and rich and to be treasured. And we did not hear you when you shared your vision. In our zeal to tell you the good news of Jesus Christ, we were closed to the value of your spirituality. We confused Western ways and culture with the depth and breadth and length and height of the gospel of Christ. This is like the marriage of church and empire that I'm going to talk about. We imposed our civilization as a condition for accepting the gospel. We tried to make you be like us, and in so doing, we helped to destroy the vision that made you what you were. As a result, you and we are poor, and the image of the Creator in us is twisted, blurred, and we're not what we're meant by God to be. And we ask you to forgive us and to walk together in the Spirit of Christ so that our peoples may be blessed and God's creation healed. And that was the apology that was made. And Bob Smith took that into a teepee, sat with the elders for a number of hours, and came out again at the end. And the elders were amazing. They came out and they basically said, thank you for the apology. We don't accept it. They had worked so hard to get this apology. We don't accept it. Let's see what happens next. A massive gift, right? Enter into relationship with us was what it was. We'll think about that. We'll come back to you. We'll see what happens. But the proof will be in the pudding for you. And I'll say here, like you might have seen it when I was sharing the apology, here, the essence of their response, right, is beautiful, right? This was the response. 2 years later, it took for the elders to deliberate on their response to the apology. And they talk about it as being an important step forward. Heartening to see the church as a forerunner in making this apology to Native people. One of the things that happened was within the church, there was created an all-Native circle conference. So at the level of regions in the United Church, there are conferences that spread across, that are like different provinces across the country. And an all-Native circle was created that was a place where Indigenous congregations have their own voice in the governance of the church. And so this was now, and so they debated and they said, we've now acknowledged your apology, not accepted it, we acknowledged it. We've continued to affirm the teachings of the Native way of life. Our spiritual teachings and values have taught us to uphold the sacred fire, to be guardians of Mother Earth, and so on. And so we ask, this was what we were asked to do. We ask only of you to respect our sacred fire, the creation, and to live in peaceful coexistence with us. It was an invitation into permanent and ongoing peaceful relationship. We recognize that hurts and feelings will continue amongst our people through partnership and walking hand in hand. The Indian spirit will eventually heal. Through our love, understanding, and sincerity, the brotherhood and sisterhood of unity, strength, and respect can be achieved. Native people of the All-Native Circle Conference hope and pray that the apology is not symbolic. So it was very important that it not be symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity. We appreciate the freedom for culture and religious expression in this new spirit this apology has created. Let us unite our hearts and minds in the wholeness of life that the Great Spirit has given us. You know, it's a very graceful response because it says we want to be in relationship. We want this not to be symbolic. We want this to be meaningful, and we will always be waiting and watching and looking for healing. Since then, the United Church has created a healing fund. There was a subsequent apology in 1998 to residential school survivors, specifically for the harms done in residential schools. And then in the settlement that happened in 2013, at the forming of the TRC, the United Church committed to paying several millions of dollars in reparations, and all of that was paid out And so, but it's not just that. There's an ongoing fund of $1 million that the church invests in grassroots Indigenous initiatives every year. So that money is granted out every year to folks doing all kinds of things, including language reclamation and mapping territories and other things. So they continue to be in relationship corporately. But what does it mean for a practitioner? Well, for me, on the next day after that apology was issued in 1986, I was about 2 weeks away from entering my university studies. I was going to go to Trent University in Ontario, in Peterborough, and I was going to study a history degree in preparation to then do a master's in divinity so I could be a minister in the church. And when I was confronted the next day by a minister from northern Manitoba called Tom Little, a Cree minister, he asked me, what are you going to do personally about this apology? And I suspect actually that many of the Indigenous folks who were in the room there had decided this is what we were going to do. We're just going to ask people personally what your apology was going to be, because I find all too often the apologies that are made are actually corporate statements, and the harm that is felt is actually individual, right? So it's a bit of a weird disequilibrium, It's like individuals were harmed by the residential school experience. Individuals have been harmed by genocide, by cultural colonial domination in this continent, and as individuals have told their stories, they're met with corporate apologies. So what is the role of an individual then? And as we said in 1998, the moderator of the United Church at that time said that our ancestors have received many blessings being on this continent, and for that we also have to be responsibility for the hurts that have been caused in receiving those blessings. So it's not that you can just reap the rewards of being someone who's lived on this continent, but we also need to realize how ongoing harm is perpetuated. So I was asked, what are you personally going to do? And I said, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it much, but I was going to go to Trent University, which has the first and oldest Native Studies program in the country. And I said, I'll take Native Studies courses. And my friend Tom said to me, he was kind of taken aback, and he said, wow, you're the first person I've asked who said you're going to do something. Everybody else said, oh, I don't know how I'm going to live the apology out. I haven't really thought about it. And to me, the experience was transformational. So I went to Trent University that next year, and I started studying Native Studies, among other things, but I ended up majoring in Native Studies. And as a part of doing that, I was invited to work and help a traditional elder who was reestablishing an Ojibwe religion called the Medeawin across parts of southern Ontario where it hadn't been practiced since the 1920s, largely because it was made illegal. And so we were building sweat lodges, we were having traditional feasts, and I was working as an Oshkobeowis, which is a medicine man's helper, basically. And in that role, that very powerful and humbling role of being able to assist in ceremony, it was the first time I was opened up as a young Protestant Christian to the idea that there might be other ways of understanding God, other than going to church every Sunday, that there might be mystical ways of understanding God, that there might be experiences that are connected to land, that are connected in community in a very different way, that are connected to ceremony in a way that is not the dry liturgy that I grew up with in the United Church. And I think my understanding and appreciation through participating in those ceremonies really opened up my understanding of what we mean by God, what we experience as God, and what we mean in terms of, and what spiritual practice and prayer can really mean as well. And so for a number of years, I helped in the reestablishment of this traditional religion, and subsequently left the church. I didn't pursue my degree as a minister, but instead I went to work with Indigenous organizations, where I have been working for the most part since the late 80s and early 90s ever since. I started working with friendship centers, which are urban cultural and social organizations that support urban Indigenous communities. And since then, I've gone on to work in the treaty process in British Columbia and with many First Nations and Indigenous organizations, really from a strong social justice bent. From the United Church, I inherited my love of activism and social justice, and so I've always been informed in that sense. I have a strong conception of Jesus as a social change agent, of somebody who spent his time with the marginalized, with the ill, those requiring healing, those who were being colonized, those who were outsiders, those who were not considered part of the mainstream, that he was always at the margins and at the edges. And the call as I mean, I just feel the strong call as a Christian is to be in those places as well. That's where my spiritual path leads me. So in respect of moving to British Columbia, which I did with my family in 1994 with my partner, and then our children were both born here, became increasingly aware of the fact, especially when you move to British Columbia, that in this land there are no treaties actually. Right, and I was working in the treaty process when I first moved here. In other words, I was working with the federal government, helping to create the modern day treaties, because this land was never properly dealt with. In British Columbia, if you think about it, it's kind of a weird thing. If you own land in British Columbia, you can ask, how is it possible that you own land? The Canadian state showed up here, basically in 1851, planted a flag on the mountains and said, this now belongs to the Crown. Indigenous nation said, that doesn't make any sense. Would you like to talk about it? And basically the state said no. And from that whole time, Indigenous folks have been saying, we really need to talk about you being here. We're not really consenting to any of this stuff at all. For about 50 years, that conversation was made illegal, right? So the Indian Act banned First Nations hiring lawyers, talking about land claims. They banned potlatches, which is the form of indigenous governance in many places on the coast here. So, did whatever it could, the state did whatever it could to take away the fact that these conversations could happen. And so what does it mean for somebody literally living on stolen land? I own a house here, I own a piece of property here on this little island, and I don't have, there's no provenance that says that this land was given. There's no treaty that said this. So a lot of my work, I've done a lot of work with the Squamish Nation, and a lot of that is around becoming aware of my place as a settler, literally as a settler on these lands. I'm in deep relationship with the Squamish Nation, having both worked for them as a consultant, but also in terms of doing things like helping to create a language organization that has, Kuyat Stalmach, which is an organization that's increasing fluency in the Squamish Nation, and so on. So there's a relationship piece there. As a member of the board of Rivendell, I was asked at one point if I could come up with a territorial acknowledgement for our organization. And that has led us into a conversation about what does it really mean to be living on this territory. When we just say, oh, we live in Squamish traditional territory and we acknowledge the Squamish Nation. Well, what more can we do around that? So any of us who own land here may be involved in, I think, in a deeper way. There's a couple of things that my own practice has led us to do, which is to say that there is a rich spiritual tradition here. There is a rich tradition of relationship on these lands. The Squamish Nation throughout history has always been one of asking for relationship with colonizers and saying, please don't come and colonize us. We want to be in relationship together with those that are settling on the lands. We think that there can be something bigger that is created together. That's been my understanding. And so it's always been about responding to this relational piece. And as the elders asked us in 1988, and I take seriously the commitment to that response to the apology, to be in relationship, to walk side by side, and to see what it is that we can do. Now, as religious people, for me, my understanding of God is entirely an understanding of the interrelationship and interconnectedness of things in the universe. That God is relationship. And in Christianity, we talk about the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or the God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. And those are what's known as an indwelling relationship. So it's like when we think of those in a way like those three faces of what we mean by God, we see them all as being in relation to one another, as fundamentally relational. Indigenous worldviews, whether it was through the Medewan religion that I experienced working with Paul Bourgeois in Trent, or through the folks that I've been working with here on the West Coast, all come down to relationship. You hear this constantly. It's a relational worldview, it's a relational spirituality, and it translates in human relations as well. And that means that human relationships also become sacred, because they become the form in which we bring the sacred into the material world. It's through relations. Anytime we're creating separation, anytime we are seeing that difference in that sense, we have to ask ourselves whether or not we're in alignment with what God is. So for me, there's like this ongoing exploration of what does it mean to be in relationship. This doesn't end. So lots of settlers will say, well, we've apologized, we've done our thing, we've got a treaty, like, isn't it over? Can't we just get on with things? And the truth of it is that Canada is an ongoing set of relationships between people. It has been since my ancestors arrived in the 1800s and even before. And it doesn't stop once we get to a certain, number of relationship units. It's about working together and creating this ongoing relationship that changes over time. That's what treaties were intended to be. They are not termination agreements that finalize the relationship and say, you're here and you're here. From the Indigenous side, we've always been told that treaties were about, great, now we're together, let's see what we can do. Right? And for one side to kind of break that and dominate has been the huge problem. So for me, there's an idea there about living in. There's another thing I want to talk about. So there's like a few takeaways from my own story. So the first one is that churches, a lot of the accounting we have to do as we've begun to realize our role in colonization. I think churches have to do a much deeper accounting, actually, of the consequences of the marriage of church and empire that happened in 313 when Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian and legalized Christianity and made it the state religion of the Roman Empire at that point. The marriage of, I think, it's my personal opinion, but I think the marriage of church and empire in 313 was the worst moment in human history. I think it created an incredible legacy of violence, an incredible legacy of destruction that has wrapped the world in just horror and injustice and violence for the past 1700 years. Genocide, many genocides were the root of that relationship. Christianity is not inevitably tied to empire, though. In 313, when empire and church became one, there was a deep, deep thread of contemplative Christianity that was happening in the deserts of Turkey and northern Africa. In the Christian tradition, these people are referred to as the desert fathers and mothers. They were contemplatives who were experiencing God in a very deep, mystical way, in a contemplative way, who were very informed, I think, by lots of different spiritual ideas that were swirling around those places at the time, but they were anchoring them in a Christian practice. That whole tradition of what became monasticism is an entire tradition of Christianity that's been hidden from what we think of as the mainline. So when you think of churches, you think of the Roman Catholic Church or Protestant churches and cathedrals and all of that kind of thing. That seems to be the visible expression of Christianity in the world. And underneath, at the margins, has been this, in the deserts, on the islands of Western Scotland and Ireland, in Athos, in Greece, in all kinds of other places, there's been a cultivation of this contemplative strain of Christianity. And for me, that's where my practice was driven to. So the essence of the church as empire, and especially the United Church trying to become an influential member of society, in doing so, it began an operation of residential schools and continued the operation of residential schools, participating actively in the colonization and genocide on this continent. I think Christianity, in a way, can be redeemed from the churches. I think Christianity can be redeemed from the domination hierarchies and the power that's come with that wedding of church and empire. And my awareness of having to confront the legacy of genocide and the legacy that my church participated in has changed my spiritual practice and actually driven me into these places where I've become more contemplative. And I would say my spiritual life has thrived as a result. But I do believe that both my exposure to the Medewan, my exposure in other interfaith contexts, as well as looking at these threads of Christian practice that have largely been practiced by women, largely been practiced by mystics, and by monks who did it in a kind of hermetically sealed place, has actually opened up my faith life in a completely different way and grounded me in social action. So part of the contemplative path is not simply withdrawing from the world and then just being a hermit. There is that little aspect of it. But almost all contemplative traditions have a cycle of calming oneself, sitting down, entering into silence and relationship with God, and then getting up off your cushion and getting to work. It's to motivate the activity of love in the world. So I think if you can make these connections, confronting the legacy and the history of the United Church's complicity in residential schools and colonization, being an active participant in the apology actually opened up my own spiritual practice and transformed it to one in which I'm learning about how relationship and love translates on an ongoing basis in the service of healing and in the service of listening and trying to re-establish the relationship that Indigenous folks have always asked for folks on this continent. To me, it has always been an open invitation. Despite everything that has gone on, the invitation has always been there to say, nobody's saying go away. We're saying enter and be in relationship. That's typically what my experience has been. And when we do that, when we humble ourselves to that role of saying, I'm no more superior. I'm not bringing a superior religion. I'm not bringing a superior way of organizing or governing. I am being on this land and looking for ways that we can create a shared experience, guided by, led by Indigenous folks that have been here for tens of thousands of years. Suddenly everything becomes richer. I think the last thing I want to show you is like, what does that look like in terms of practical expressions? And I'm just going to show you one thing we did last year. Here, you can see this is our welcome sign when you come to the ferry. When you come to Bowen Island, you'll see that Bowen Island welcomes you. We're very welcoming. And up here, it's kind of hard to see. Maybe I can zoom in on it a little bit. But it says wlélex, which is also what it says on my name here on the Zoom. If you look at the name there, my name, it says wlélex. Wlélex is the Squamish name for Bowen Island. And we're beginning a process of putting those names back on the map. I'm involved in a project called SquamishAtlas.com, which has a couple of hundred Squamish names in a database, and you can look at the. In fact, I will show you the website. You can look up the place where you are, and you can get a sense of. Hang on a sec. You can get a sense of what the place name is, and there's also some teachings that come with that. So let me just give you I'll show you what that looks like. This is a really important piece of action, putting names back on the landscape, because these names are ancient and have been here forever and ever. And the names that are here on the land have a deep relationship to the spiritual teachings that are here as well. So for example, this is the Squamish Atlas, and you can see if you zoom in on particular places, for example, if I click on this, I get the name Quamshnam. That's the very northern part of Bowen Island. I live here, just around the top of this bay. But Quamshnam means stomping feet, or the noise of a stomping heel. And this is a place name that was given because what happened here was that back in the myth times, in the Squamish creation stories, there were a series of brothers that traveled through the land, transforming things and changing things into other things. And every place they changed something, they left a teaching. And here in Quamshnam, this little point of land here, they met a hunter who was proud and who felt his hunting abilities were superior to everybody's, that he was faster, more accurate, more deadly than anybody else, and he wasn't going to broke any competition for that. And the Transformer brothers felt that his arrogance was amusing, and being supernatural creatures, what they did was they grabbed him by the neck, and they pulled his neck, and they pulled out his arms and his legs, and lengthened them out, and they took 2 pieces of driftwood or 2 pieces of ocean spray, which is a shrub here, and they stuck them in his head. And they clapped their hands, and he ran off into the bush, making this stomping sound. And what they had done was they had turned him into a deer. And in doing so, they concluded that the deer, this animal that they had created out of this proud hunter, would actually be excellent food source for the people. And so they slowed him down, and they made him able to be caught and able to be hunted himself. And the teaching there is that I think it's, for me, one of the teachings there is that what we're called to do is transform our pride and arrogance into service for the people, to feed the people. And that's the teaching that comes from this. Now, if you don't know that if you just think this is called Hood Point, you have no idea of the teaching that lives here. But Quamshnam points to that teaching. And for Squamish folks, I know all of these places here have teachings associated with them. This is a place where Laquam is a place where the sun was captured. This place here, Cha'alchnech, is an island where the great heron the great blue heron was created. There's also a story of a whale getting stuck in a longhouse. That's all about staying in hard conversations with one another. These all have teachings all the way along here, including, the peaks known as the Lions in English in Vancouver, which lie up here, which are known as the Sisters in Squamish, and are based on are the result of two sisters who brought peace between the Squamish communities down here and the northern tribes that were warring with them, and they were immortalized as the sisters. And the teachings of those peaks are all about peace. And we look at the landscape of the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, and we see these mountains that are called the Lions because those are symbols of British domination, right? The lion is the symbol of the British, the British Empire, and the lions are out there, and the lions look over the Lionsgate Bridge, and the football team's called the BC Lions. But actually, in Squamish tradition, those are two sisters who brought peace. Those are peacemakers. And I often wonder what would be different about our place if we, called the Lionsgate Bridge the Peace Bridge, if we referred to those sisters as Chichoi, or the two sisters, and we understood the teaching of peace that comes with those mountains that look over all of Vancouver. And if we name the BC football team, like, what if we called the CFL team the BC Sisters? That would be amazing. It's like, it's the sisters against the Argonauts, So I think that there's a sense in which confronting who we are and being aware of knowing what we call it, knowing our place on Bowen Island. There's a deliberate pun in that. So the project that helped put that sign up was part of a small group of citizens that call ourselves Knowing Our Place. We study books, we bring in speakers, we do all kinds of stuff, reading everything from braiding sweetgrass to Art Manuel's work to, a whole bunch of other stuff. And then doing practical things like putting the signs up, where we may be starting a new project in the fall to put a Squamish welcome figure at the ferry dock and to pay a Squamish carver to do that. So we'll be raising money for that. But the idea of knowing our place is both one of like knowing the land in which we live on, but also knowing our place on that land. Who are we in relationship to Squamish people that are here? And as a spiritual person, for me, it's about that pursuit of relationship and love. So that is, land back. I'm involved in some land back stuff, by the way. There are a number of people there is one person in particular on Bowen Island, motivated by spirit, who's maybe involved in some land back stuff. And we're talking, as I say, anybody who's on the board of an organization in which you own land, these conversations are beginning to happen. And I think with spiritual people starting to talk about land back, language back, indigeneity back, water back, all of those kinds of things, not given as gifts, but given back, returned, right? Like literally returned. In my own, the conversation happening around the house that I live in and the property that I live on with my children has been about, like, what are we going to do when we're gone, and how do we make sure that this land eventually becomes part of the Squamish Nation again and becomes returned as well. So even as individual landowners, we can do that. But it's not just about our future. Also, it's about, okay, so if this is the case, like, how do I steward the land that I'm on now? Right? How do I steward that land now? So what do I do in order to maintain it or to make it better, heal it in a way that's is better? So, all right. Woof, there's a lot there. And there's some questions that have come up in the chat, and I can look through these. How many treaties were influenced by coercion of colonial hegemony on Indigenous peoples? It's kind of, I think, all of them in a way. But I think that Indigenous, but listen to elders. On the treaty side of things, there's a lot of documentation about what the elders were doing when they were entering into relationship there too. And understanding that although although treaties were forced on people, and still are, I would say, the treaty process I worked in British Columbia is not an equal treaty process, not a nation-to-nation treaty process. But listen to what people are saying about what their experience is coming into these. There are many sources, contemporary sources and subsequent sources, where elders were spoken to and where they spoke about what they thought those relationships meant. So I wouldn't say. It's interesting because we only know what the treaty. We think we only know what the treaty commissioners were doing because the folks that were writing stuff down were Indigenous, were the government and Crown folks, but actually we know a lot more. And there is, I've heard lots of elders talk about what treaty making was about for them. Okay, questions? Yeah, Noor has a question.
Hi, just there we are. Hello, Chris.
Noor.
Thank you for the talk. Lots of questions. Curious how you maintain you speak about the problem. It's not an even process in BC between in treaty negotiations, etc. And so you see this glaring asymmetry. Questions about the credibility of BC's rule of law when there were no treaties and everything about this society is on stolen property, and etc. So when you see these glaring asymmetries, how do you maintain a sense of equanimity? And then how do you reconcile the legacy of colonialism and apartheid with your identity as somebody who is benefiting with a lot of unearned privilege from this system? And I ask this because I'm struggling with the same issue.
Mm-hmm. Partly by helping to strengthen Indigenous governance, right, and Indigenous language, and because those are incredibly meaningful to the relationship, first of all. So there's reparations, right? So that's one thing. So, for example, I mean, it's small things. I'm talking, this is the smallest possible thing. Whenever I'm asked to do a land acknowledgement, and I often am because I'm leading meetings a lot of the time, if I'm getting paid for those meetings, I always give $200 to Kwiat Stalmach, which is supporting language fluency. And I pass a hat also and say, this is not just about if I'm working in Squamish land. In other places, like one of the last gigs I did was in Wenatchee a couple of years ago, face to face in Washington. And I didn't know the community there. So it forced me to go and look and see, like, who's out here? Like, what's the community? What's the local tribe? Oh, Colville Reservation. Well, have they got something they're raising money for? Yeah, they're actually raising money for coats for kids this winter. Great. So we do a land acknowledgement. We're here on Colville Tribe's land. We're raising money for their children to get coats, and we're going to give part of our fees to that, and we're also going to pass a hat. And it is actually remarkable that you need, to be able not just to look at nativeland.ca and see where you are, but also to contact those communities and go, how can we help? What do you need? You got elders raising money for like beading supplies. Have you got kids who need coats? Like somebody's house burned down, you've got a GoFundMe for it. Like how can we help being in this territory? And that to me is about the relationship stuff, right? That to me is about beginning to enter into that relationship. The unearned privilege. So I'll say, like, from a bigger systemic perspective, my ancestors arrived here in the 1800s, and in arriving here, whether they knew it or not, entered into a treaty relationship. I've always found the idea of we're all treaty people to be really important. All Canadian citizens are treaty people. So we have inherited not just the ability to own land, but all of the resources that pay for whatever it is that we're doing, our healthcare system, everything else, is all generated off of lands that have been either treated or untreated, but are Indigenous lands. And so there's an obligation first and foremost to see ourselves as treaty beneficiaries. And I'll never forget Adrienne Clarkson, when she was Governor General, used to go around to places, and especially in Saskatchewan, and ask rooms full of kids, like, who is the treaty people here? And all the Cree kids put up their hands because their ancestors all signed treaties, but the white kids didn't put up their hands. And it's like, well, who do they make treaties with? Like, how do these kids all identify as treaty people, but all of the non-Indigenous people don't identify as treaty people? And that's what I mean by, like, listen to Indigenous people. They take the treaties freaking seriously, right? And so it's like, oh, well, how can we reanimate this treaty relationship? Because it could be incredibly powerful. It could be incredibly powerful, but it's beyond, it's not reconciliation. It's first of all truth, and first and second of all reciprocity. So it's really about orienting our own practice into a practice of reciprocity. For me, that squares super tightly with my spiritual practice. Like I think I understand from a perspective of my relationship to God as a reciprocal one, right? And also then on this level, it's like, so what is my reciprocity, my interdependence in my relationship to others, whether it's the land, the people, and other people here too. So, and then it just doesn't end. There's like no answer, nor, right? So we're constantly being confronted with yet another problem that we need to be in relationship to work on together. And so I think it's that kind of openness piece that's really important for me as well.
I'm still struggling with how you maintain a sense of equanimity, or how do you not get enraged when you see these, the legacies of genocide.
Yeah, I do get enraged. I do. I mean, when the child's when the Kamloops school graves were revealed, I preached a sermon the next week on June 5th. It's on YouTube, actually. You can look at. Maybe we'll send you the link. You can see it. I'm enraged in that sermon. I'm enraged in that sermon because so few people just saw this coming. Like and I mean, that partly on me. Not everybody was around in 1986 involved in the apology. I understand that. There's something about being an early adopter. But 35 years, my life has been living out that commitment I made to Tom Little. And so when I preached that sermon, my minister friends who taught me to preach said, when you preach, talk about the text and then leave them with the good news, the gospel. We call it. Leave them with the good news. What's the good news? And in that sermon, I said, friends, like sometimes there's no good news. And we read from a book from the Hebrew text, which is called Lamentations, which is it's a book about being in exile. It's a book about being colonized. It's a book about being enslaved. And it is all about it's just grief. It's just like fabric wrenching grief is what that is. And I said, this is the reading we're going to do today. And I'm sorry, there's no good news at the end of this. There's no happy ending. I said that the only good news that we might have is that as followers of Jesus, if Jesus was with us right now, he would be with those babies. He would be with those grieving families, providing them with comfort, providing them with resources, taking care of their healing, doing whatever he could to make sure they were okay. And I can tell you that Jesus is not with us in this moment. And the good news, if there is any good news, is that the Jesus we follow will always welcome us to join him over there. But what we don't get to do is we don't get to pull him back. We don't get to say, oh, well, you go spend your time with the babies and then come back over here to our church so we can just get on with things. Jesus is over there. And that's where we need to go. So from a redemptive kind of place, that's what we need to be doing. So, I mean, and equanimity, I mean, that's what our spiritual practice is for, right? You're allowed to be enraged, and then, be enraged, be sad, be angry, be happy, be glad, but be open. And mostly be unsettled. I think this was one of the message of my things is that the message I've always given to settlers is that this work of being in relationship on stolen land is deeply unsettling. It will change the way you think about things. It will change who you think you are, and you will not get answers, and you will not confront certainty. And so the issue there is that you need to be unsettled. And the only job of settlers is to be unsettled. And if you can be unsettled, then you can be in relationship with people whose comfort you've been unsettling for generations, right? And then we can just figure out what to do. We can be in the mess together, which is, in my experience, all I've ever been asked to do. The only times I've ever been called out by elders, largely grannies, I've been scolded by many, many Indigenous elders. I'm proud to wear the scars of scoldings from aunties and elders over the years. But the only time I've ever been called out is when I've been arrogant enough to say that I know what I'm doing. You don't know what you're doing. It's like, oh shit, that's right. I don't know what I'm doing. This is a very unsettling moment. Good. Get used to it. It's helpful. So, sorry, are there other questions? I thought, Jabala, did you have your hand up, or others? Some had their hands up and down again.
Yeah, so again, if you ever attend any of my sessions, you'll realize I probably should be asking more questions, but I'm so busy in responding to everything that's going on. So forgive me. I have lots of questions for you. But right now, I just really wanted to comment on, first of all, thank you for any good works you do. I wonder if you ever considered stepping away from the identity as a church member and moving more towards being like a mystic on the land. And I thank you for any contributions you've made. I heard you make a comment about taking and splitting some of your earnings and donating to various groups. We see this as a tribe, we as a tribal person, I see where some are donating to various, I'll call them First Nations entities, such as maybe the friendship centers, or I've even seen, especially during the fires, churches and different ones donating directly to the chief and council systems. I have a problem with this. I mean, not with the people donating, because they're maybe doing some things out of the goodness of their heart. But what I'm seeing is there's a problem with the institutionalization of the chief and council systems. I would say, like I did yesterday and the day before, they're not the voice of the people, and a lot of these funds aren't actually reaching the tribes. I think that if all the efforts collectively over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, any of the good actions that have been sent towards the tribal people have had minimal effect, because it's actually not reaching the need. It's not reaching down to the bottom, where we're actually seeing the tribal people still go without, whereas the elected chief and council systems are advancing. And I see a lot of ego still in those systems that are set up. And I mean, let's be honest, if the genocide, in the genocide, it was designed in a way to perpetually keep the problem going. And the reason I say that is through the genocide, they weren't their only focus. They were very exacted in how they sought out and examined the native people. The churches were heavily involved in this, examining the characters of the native people to see who the weak ones were and who the strong ones were. And they've targeted those strong families, and they were the first ones to be wiped out. Very few of us have survived of strong lineages. And I don't want to say there's one lineage that's more powerful than another, but I can say that the way tribal structure in the olden way was structured around those who were able to take the lead and put their egos aside and care for the collective. And so what I'm seeing these days is, even though we're always like, oh, let's support the tribes, and we'll stay, and we see all these leadership among the tribes stepping forward and making deals and talking reconciliation with the churches and the government and all this talk, it's really needs to be known that the tribal people have sort of taken a back seat to that. And one comment, I know it's in my comments, I put it in the chat, but I want to say it. So we have these leadership entities, I don't know what to call them, but we have people in leadership, and we also have a bunch of Canadians. So we're all sitting here on this land together. But I know when I was growing up and I was in school, we had to stand up and sing the national anthem. And now in the current era, they're talking about bringing truth into Native history teachings in schools. But I gotta say, I don't know any Canadians that actually have opened, like, there's some, I mean, obviously we're all here and we've been studying and researching this because we've been called to do so, or we have it in our hearts. But there's so many Canadians that have probably never ever looked at a treaty, never read the context of it. And so I totally agree with what you said about, like how many people can stand up and say, this was what I promised the tribes.
Right.
Because we're leaving it to the leadership to talk.
Couple of things there, Jabala.
On both.
Sorry, yeah, your connection was really choppy there. Just a couple of things on that. First of all, the resources I give are usually personal, so they're most often to individuals and to people that I meet, like people that are doing some stuff. I mean, the money we raise for Kwiat Stalmach goes to support individual language learners to pay for their living expenses so they can take 9 months out of their lives to become fluent in the language. Like, it's a direct material benefit. And to me, I think that that's important. If you're doing something and it's not directly materially benefiting individuals, that's not on. The other thing I'll say is that, like, everybody's different. And for some communities, Squamish Nation, for example, is the chief and council are very, very important. And there is a hereditary leadership piece that goes on there as well. And that relationship is very clear and very articulated to the rest of the world so that people know what's going on. And that's different in many other tribal governments and organizations as well. And so, yeah, there's lots in the stuff you're saying. The other thing I'll say is that we did a land acknowledgement in New Brunswick for a workshop I was doing there a few years ago. And one of the things that people did was we read the treaty together that covered the territory. And in the land acknowledgement, we talked about the obligations that settlers have that are actually included in the treaty. Like, this is what we'll do. We'll live peacefully. We won't bother each other. Like, that's what the promise was, right? So are you bothering people? Are you living peacefully on this land? Are you in relationship? Are you allowing Indigenous people in New Brunswick to live their best lives? And so we actually read that selection of the treaty. And I agree, like, read the treaties that govern the lands where you live, if there are any, is a good piece. Zaneb, I see you have your hand up. Sorry.
Hi, good afternoon, Chris. Thanks for letting me speak. Forgive me, I actually just joined and I was giving the kids lunch, so prime lunchtime for the kiddies. So the other thing is that I am far from the academia or practitioner section, as I've been hearing the speakers the last three days. Quite intimidating, I have to admit. So I'm going to ask you a very layman kind of question. Mm-hmm. I see here in your Twitter about 17 hours ago, you posted, hey there's an election on. Remember that this summer, many First Nations started investigating unmarked graves, and we had a wide range of conversation in Canada about confronting the genocide on this continent. Ask your candidates about doing this relationship differently. Mm-hmm. So here's my question. A young Indigenous lady and we have been in touch with my member of parliament, Ikra Khalid, and just so our audience is aware, Ikra Khalid is also the sponsor for the anti-Islamophobia bill. So she's actually in my writing, and that's basically the premises. I am approaching her that, listen, you're a big supporter of this. Can you also be a big supporter of doing the radar cost investigations? Mm. Now, they are not getting back to me so well. They say it, but they don't do it. Mm. And how much can I pressure? How far can a petition go? The young lady, she already had a petition going. I actually got a cost of how much the charge was for Kamloops in terms of the radar investigation. Cost about $10,000 per acre. So for the Ontario schools, or at least closest to my writing, which is Brantford, it's not a whole lot of money. The most expensive part is probably the investigation of the forensic of the bones. Mm-hmm. But that's stage 2. What do you suggest for stage 1, that they get the conversation on the table, get them to actually schedule it, and then, this next part starts of the pressure? What do you suggest in that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think claim your place as a person that has the right to ask that question too, like as a Canadian, as a person who's living on these lands, this is not the relationship I want to be in, where we underfund Indigenous communities, where we prevent the investigation and the truth of residential schools from coming up to bear. Like, claim that space to talk somehow. I mean, of course, there's always when we're trying to reach our elected officials, and especially at the federal level, it's really hard. So it's about movement building, and it's about those kinds of things as well. But also, for me, it's also taken the lead from First Nations as well. So where I live, Squamish territory, the Squamish Nation actually got the Catholic Church to pay for it. So they actually, before they made an announcement just last month with the Catholic Church present, saying, we're entering into a relationship with the Catholic Church. We're going to investigate the records. I mean, it wasn't, in this case, it's not radar, ground penetrating radar, because they don't have that ability with the sites here because they've been so disturbed. But the Catholic Church and the Squamish Nation are in a relationship to discover the names of children that went missing, that never came home from St. Mary's Residential School at Eslihan. And I think that's, again, all First Nations who have residential schools in their territories are engaged in this work. And it's like, the question you're asking me is the question that you should be asking, for example, in Six Nations, the Six Nations Council as well, and the Clan Mothers. and what they're up to and what they're wanting to do, and taking direction there. That's my thought. That's what I would do. Anyway, I know we're at the end of our time, Aslam, and I apologize we went over a little bit there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think as with many of these conversations, it will continue. And I'm glad that at the end of the day today, we've got more time to process and think through how we move forward together. But Chris, thank you so much for your time. And I appreciate also as part of your, like when we were planning this, like you also asked for your fee to be donated or put towards those who might need it more. So appreciate that as well. And just wanting to name that.